Coming to you from beautiful Vancouver, Canada, this is Scuderia F1, the podcast that is always up to speed with the latest Formula One news. Follow us on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod and subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and Stitcher. Now, here's your host, Mark Daly.
Hello and welcome to Scuderia F1, the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One racing. My name is Mark Daly, I'm your host, and welcome to episode number 1. Yes, we finally made it to the starting grid after a couple of months of planning, and since the Formula One season officially gets underway in Melbourne, Australia a little bit later on this week, then I thought this was a really good chance to sit down and just introduce the show, introduce myself, and just outline some of my goals and my plans for the season ahead, and get the podcast feed at iTunes and Stitcher populated just so people can find it once the season gets rolling in a couple of days, because I plan to release shows on a fairly regular basis, definitely after every Grand Prix weekend. So this is the ideal opportunity just to get my name out here and get the podcast started. Anyways, as I mentioned, my name is Mark Daly. I'm a sports writer for Van City Buzz, which is the largest digital-only publication here in Western Canada. I've been covering the Vancouver Whitecaps of Major League Soccer since 2013, and I started out writing for a website called 86forever.com. And about 2.5 years ago, I also co-founded the From the Backline podcast, which is a show that is dedicated mostly to the Whitecaps, Major League Soccer, and soccer in general. And I host that with my good friend and colleague, Jorge Mendoza. So for those of you who have heard of From the Backline before, or you do listen to the show, you're probably wondering where Jorge is. And I'm going to have to disappoint you because he's not actually going to be hosting the show with me for the simple reason that he's not a Formula One fan and he has no idea what I'm going to be talking about all season long. He still is involved behind the scenes, helping out with some production and things like that. So hopefully at some point he'll get enthused in Formula One and perhaps we'll even be doing a show together at some point, but we'll wait and see. All right, a little bit more about the show format. I'm going to be hosting the show by myself, so I have never hosted a podcast on my own, which is incredible to say considering Jorge and myself have released over 130 episodes of From the Backline starting in October 2013. And although Jorge has been quite good and brave on several occasions to fly solo and host the show by himself, whenever he's been away, I've never actually done that. Whenever I've had to do the show without him, I've always called in a guest or called in Roturo or somebody to co-host with me. So this is completely new. So if it takes me a couple of episodes to kind of get into my groove, I hope you guys will bear with me and just let things evolve over the next couple of episodes. So the plan is right now to release a show bi-weekly or at least after every Grand Prix weekend. So we'll see over the next month or two how the schedule goes and how everything syncs up nicely with the Formula One schedule. So it might be a little bit erratic in the beginning, but we'll find something that works both with the Formula One calendar and with my schedule as well. So the idea behind the show is that it will feature the latest Formula One news and rumors, race analysis, Formula One tech, and I'll try and get some guests on the show once we get settled and everything's rolling along nicely here. Okay, so I've got social media and a website and everything all set up. So if you want to get in touch with me, easiest way is on Twitter at Scuderia F1. Email is scuderiaf1pod@gmail.com. Instagram, Scuderia F1, and also the website is scuderiaf1pod.com. All right, well, that's enough background information on the show. Why don't we talk a little bit about Formula One and the new season coming up? When I was sitting down preparing for the podcast tonight, I was writing down and going over some of the big questions that I have in my mind as the season gets going. And the first one is the dominance of Mercedes-Benz. We've seen over the last couple of years just how they've really taken the sport by the scruff of the neck, back-to-back world champions for both in the constructors and drivers. Lewis Hamiton, obviously a back-to-back world champion in 2014 and 2015. I just have to wonder this year, are they still that much further ahead than the competition? We saw last year that Ferrari was a little bit closer to Mercedes than they were in 2014, and they did offer some challenges here here and there, but by and large, Mercedes were still in a class of their own. If you even look at the Constructors' Championship last year, Mercedes were miles ahead. They had 703 points compared to 428 points for Ferrari, who were in second place, and 257 for Williams, who were in a distant third. So if Mercedes still is way out at the front ahead of everyone else in 2016, who becomes world champion this year? In my mind, at least, it has to be one of their own drivers because they have been just so much better than everyone else. But will it be Lewis Hamilton winning a third title in a row? Or can Nico Rosberg finally pull it off and win a title for himself? Only time will tell. If you go back just a couple of years, back to 2014, the first half of the season, I thought, was pretty even between the two of them. But the big turning point for me, and I think many others, came at the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa when the two had a coming together on the opening lap, and Nico Rosberg came off the worst out of that little collision, and he had a punctured tire and ended up limping all the way back to the pits. Unfortunately, that basically ended his race that day. If you get that far behind at Spa, it takes almost a miracle to get back in contention. And that was the defining moment of the 2014 Formula One season. After that coming together at Spa, the momentum shifted in Lewis's favor, and it's stayed there ever since. He's basically been unstoppable. For the rest of the 2014 season, things seemed to go his way, and last year in 2015, at least through the first 3 quarters of the season, he was unstoppable. Things went his way while Nico was stuck in a rut, and it just seemed like he just couldn't get any luck to go his way. But we saw after Lewis had basically been crowned the Formula One champion, when he had racked up enough points, that things started to shift again, and Rosberg definitely finished the year on a high note. But you could make the argument that Lewis wasn't pushing quite as hard because he had the title sewn up, but I don't necessarily buy that argument because I come into contact with a lot of elite athletes. Granted, they're footballers and not Formula One drivers, but the mentality is the same. These are people that are driven to succeed. They have only one thing in mind, and that is to win. And Formula One is the pinnacle. It's the peak of motorsport, and it's one of the biggest sports in the world. And there's big egos there. There's a lot of money at stake. There's a lot of prestige at stake. So just to suggest that one guy, Lewis, for example, is eased off just because he's won the world championship, I don't necessarily buy that. I think that Nico towards the end of the year actually beat Lewis fair and square, and I think that Lewis doesn't like that. I think he's the kind of guy that would probably want to assert his position over Nico, and I don't think he liked it at all. So the rivalry between these two drivers is going to be something really interesting to watch over the course of the season. Okay, so moving along, the next thing I'm looking at for 2016 is McLaren Honda. Are they going to get back on form and be competitive this year, or is it going to be more of the same for the Woking-based outfit? Last year, it was really sad to see them struggling the way that they were. They finished the year with only 27 points, and that was only good enough for 9th in the Constructors' Championship. And that must have been pretty frustrating for Fernando Alonso and Jenson Button, who are both former world champions, to go from fighting at the front of the grid to being stuck in the middle or back of the grid, and sometimes not even making it into qualifying or to the race itself. So hopefully for McLaren's sake, Honda is able to get some more power and reliability out of that power unit for this year. I did notice some reports over the winter months that they had reportedly found another 230 horsepower in the engine, but Honda quickly downplayed it, saying that the advances and the improvements weren't anything that was being reported. But what you can't ignore is the fact that Honda was behind compared to some of the other engine manufacturers, because many of the other teams like Ferrari and Mercedes, they were preparing their engines for several years prior to the new rules that came in 2014, and Honda was completely out of the loop. So when they announced in 2013 that they would be coming back into Formula One with McLaren, they had to play a lot of catch-up. So what we saw in 2015 was an engine that was still being developed, an engine that still had problems with it, and they need to get those problems sorted out. McLaren is too big of a team to be stuck where they're at, and Ron Dennis, Eric Boullier, and the entire McLaren team have been working hard over the entire winter, and I believe that they even worked over Christmas. So they're serious about getting this thing turned around. Whether or not they will remains to be seen. Okay, now rule changes. Now with the big changes coming in 2017 regarding the formula and so many other things that will be changing next year, we might not see as many technical advancements as we're used to. Some of the changes we will see this year are in regards to the engine exhausts and perhaps a change and maybe some louder Formula One engines, which seems to be a complaint from some fans and some people around in the Formula One world. So we'll see whether or not that materializes or not. Some of the other changes we will see are in regards to the tires. There is obviously a new tire compound coming out this year. Pirelli has introduced an ultra soft compound, and they will decide prior to every race in conjunction with the FIA what 3 tire compounds will be available. There'll be 5 for every race, and 2 of those will be the inters and the wet tires. There's also a complicated set of rules regarding mandatory tire sets as chosen by Pirelli, and the teams will also have to choose in advance what tire compounds they want to use for every Grand Prix. Now, the big change we'll see in Grand Prix weekends itself regards the qualifying. I've looked over the new rules for the qualifying sessions, and at first I wasn't a big fan of it, but I've changed my position on it. I liked the old format, but I think I'm going to like this one even better. So basically what happens is you still have 3 qualifying sessions. The first session in Q1 will be 16 minutes long, and after 7 minutes, the slowest car will be eliminated, and then 1 car every 90 seconds after that over the next 9 minutes. So 6 more cars will be eliminated in Q1. Then you move into Q2, which is 15 minutes long. And again, after 7 minutes, the slowest car is eliminated. And then 1 car after every 90 seconds. Then you get into Q3, and that is 14 minutes long. The slowest car is cut after 5 minutes, and then 1 car after every 90 seconds. And then what happens is you get down to the last 90 seconds, you'll have 2 cars left, and basically what you'll get is a shootout. They'll fight it out for pole position. So this could actually be quite exciting. Like I said, I did like the old format of Q1, Q2, and Q3, and basically you would have the 5 slowest cars or whatever it was cut after every qualifying session. But then it was up to the cars and the teams and the drivers to go out within the allotted time to try and set the fastest time. And quite often it came down to the very last lap, that very last hot lap in Q3 to actually set pole position. But at other times, it was actually quite boring. At times, you'd have all the cars sitting in the pits and nothing really happening out on the track. So this could actually be quite exciting. Some of the drivers like Hamilton and Alonso have come out and said that they don't really like the new format, but I'm willing to keep an open mind and see whether or not this delivers a spectacle or an excitement or not. And it could be quite cool. Okay, so finally, before we go, I'm going to go to the mailbag. This is something that we do at From the Back Line quite often, and it's usually quite a popular segment. So I got a tweet today from Maddie at Dear Mailman on Twitter, and he wanted to hear my thoughts on the proposals for the Halo, and that's the head protection that goes around the cockpit. Now, this is pretty simple. When it comes to Formula One, it is a dangerous sport. There's high speeds involved and multiple cars, and things can happen in an instant, good or bad. Now, I think that element of danger and the speed is obviously the appeal of Formula One. But above all, it has to be safe. It has to be safe for the drivers, the pit crew, the marshals, the fans, everybody that is involved in a Grand Prix or watching a Grand Prix, and especially for the drivers, because they are the ones that are taking the most risk. I didn't really like some of the early concepts I saw for the Halo, but the one I really liked was the one that was put out by Red Bull Racing. Now, basically, you have this Halo, which is a solid structure that kind of comes around the outside of the cockpit to protect the driver's head. But their take on it was not only to have this protective structure, but also to have like a clear perspex going around it. Obviously, that has a little bit more protective qualities to it, and you would have to think that there would be some aerodynamic advantage to it as well. And of course, Formula One being what it is, people are always looking for an advantage or a way to improve the performance of their car. And I like that one. I'll tweet out a picture for that one. So thank you for that tweet, Maddie. Now, finally, before I wrap the show up, this very first introductory show, I just want to take the moment and let's go over some predictions. We talked a little bit earlier on about Hamilton and Rosberg, and that most likely one of those two guys will be the world champion this year. But of course, that really depends on what the other teams do. I'm sure that Sebastian Vettel, who is obviously a 5-time world champion himself, will want to have a say in this conversation. And if Ferrari turns out to be more competitive than they were last year, then perhaps he'll be a guy that we'll see on the top step of the podium. But most likely, I think it is going to be Hamilton or Rosberg. And I'm going to say it right now. I'm going to take a bit of a risk. I'm going to say that Nico Rosberg will be the world champion in 2016. So let's meet back here at the end of November after Abu Dhabi and see how the season shakes down. But that is my prediction based on nothing other than gut feeling that Nico will be the world champion in 2016. Okay, it's time to start wrapping up this very first episode of Scuderia F1. And before I go, I'd like to give a very special shout out to Andrew Chobianek, Bart DeWitt, Jorge Mendoza, and James Buffton, who were all contributors to the Indiegogo crowdfunding campaign. So thank you very much, guys. I appreciate you getting involved and helping me get to the starting grid here and get this podcast rolling. And I look forward to being here all year long. So thank you for your support. Okay, before we go, I just want to throw out the contact information one final time. If you want to get in touch like Maddie did, who sent me the question about the Halo, easiest way is Twitter at Scuderia F1. If Twitter's not your thing, the easiest alternative would be email, and that is scuderiaf1pod@gmail.com. I'd like to thank you all for listening and downloading this very first episode of Scuderia F1. The very first Grand Prix is up in a couple of days, and I will be back next week to bring you a breakdown of the Australian Grand Prix and any other Formula One news that comes out. And until then, this is your host, Mark Daly, signing off. We'll see you again next week.
Thanks for listening to the Scuderia F1 Podcast. If you want to get the show notes for this episode, then head over to ScuderiaF1Pod.com. Want to get in touch with us? Then email us at ScuderiaF1Pod@gmail.com.